Welcome to a new episode of Soundblot, the International Society for Rorschach and Projective Methods podcast. Featuring exclusive interviews, the Soundblot wishes to contribute to the oral storytelling tradition by taking ISR members on a personal encounter with notable Rorschach and projective method experts. We want our listeners to hear our guests relate stories and discussions about their research, theories, practice, and collaborative experiences that have changed their lives and the landscape of the Rorschach and projective methods field. We are happy to speak today with a world-renowned guest, Reid Meloy. Dr. Reid Meloy is a board-certified forensic psychologist, APPP, and consults on criminal and civil cases throughout the US and Europe. He is a former clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine, and a faculty member of the San Diego Psychoanalytic Center. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences and is past president of the American Academy of Forensic Psychology. He has received a number of awards and honors, including the first National Achievement Award in 1998 from the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, the Manfred Guttmacher Award from the American Psychiatric Association in 2021, and the Distinguished Contribution to Forensic Psychology Award from the American Academy of Forensic Psychology in 2022. He was the Jochelson Visiting Scholar at Yale University in 2015 and Visiting Scholar at the Psychiatric University Hospital Zurich, originally the Burskol-Holzli Clinic, in 2018. Dr. Meloy has authored and co-authored over 250 papers published in peer-reviewed psychiatric and psychological journals, and has authored, co-authored, or edited 13 books. He has been consulting, researching, and writing about personality disorder, psychopathy, stalking, narcissism, criminality, mental disorder, and targeted violence for the past 30 years. His first book, The Psychopathic Mind, was an integration of the biological and psychodynamic understanding of psychopathy. His co-edited book with Drs. Hoffman and Sheridan, Stalking, Threatening, and Attacking Public Figures, led to a commissioned study for the National Academy of Sciences on threats towards public figures, published in 2011. The first edition of the International Handbook of Threat Assessment was published in 2014, and the second edition in 2021. Dr. Stephen White and he created the WAVR-21, a widely utilized structured professional judgment instrument for targeted workplace and campus violence, now in its third edition. Dr. Meloy has been a consultant on criminal, counterintelligence, and counterterrorism cases for the Behavioral Analysis Unit, FBI, Quantico, for the past 21 years. His counterterrorism work began when he was retained as the consulting forensic psychologist by the U.S. Attorney General in the prosecution of the defendant McVeigh and Nichols in the Oklahoma City bombing cases. He is the originator and developer of the TRAP-18 Terrorist Radicalization Assessment Protocol, a validated risk assessment instrument used by counterterrorism professionals in North America, Europe, and Australia. He was a member of the Fixated Research Group for the United Kingdom's Home Office concerning threats to the royal family and British political figures, and is a consulting member of Work Trauma Services, Inc., headquarters in San Francisco, and Team Psychology and Security in Darmstadt, Germany. He was also a founding associate editor of the Journal of Threat Assessment and Management. Dr. Meloy is intermittently quoted in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and NPR. He was a technical consultant to the television series CSI from its inception in 2000 until its final episode in 2015, and is the technical consultant to Indivisible, Healing Hate, a Paramount Plus television series exploring the historical roots of the January 6, 2021 insurrection. Thank you very much, Dr. Meloy, for agreeing to do this podcast to the members of the International Society for Rorschach and Projective Methods today.
Thank you, Giselle. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your professional activities at this time or throughout your career as you watch.
Sure, I'd be happy to. My work right now centers on threat assessment for acts of targeted violence, looking at both attempting to understand these individuals, why they do what they do, but more importantly, preventive work. So I work with universities, colleges, corporations, and various government agencies, as well as other law enforcement bodies, to help them develop tactics and strategies to reduce the frequency of targeted attacks. And what I mean by targeted attacks are where an individual has planned and prepared to carry out an act of violence. And unfortunately, our country is a sea of problems regarding violence, particularly firearm violence, because of the proliferation of firearms in the country, as well as violence that involves the killing of multiple individuals that, of course, gets a fair amount of attention in the news. And so it's a huge social problem that also has political ramifications in this country. And that is where I devote most of my time currently. And it is basically expressed in three different ways. One are the consultations that I do on cases. Secondly is teaching. So I do a lot of teaching and training and lecturing and invited addresses to talk to various groups, generally professionals. I typically don't do any speaking engagements to the general public, but it's basically teaching professionals about these matters. And then thirdly, doing research. And that's been a very gratifying part of my work throughout my career, is to be able to collaborate with other people and to do research. And I've been doing that for the entire time that I've been a psychologist, and actually began to do that prior to becoming a psychologist. And it's still very gratifying for me to be working closely with colleagues. And now, of course, we can do that so easily worldwide, where we can be sending papers to each other and making modifications in those papers and then submitting them for publication. So I still get I'm like an excited little boy when I get a paper accepted for publication, and I still get a big kick out of it, even though it's happened many, many times now throughout the years. But it's still very, very enjoyable for me. It's like it's sort of like a little gift I'm giving to the world, and it also, I think, draws on the kind of the sense of wanting to do work that takes a lot of time. It's very detailed. You have to be very patient about it. And you're trying to do the best possible work you can, because you know it's also going to be your legacy. And as I've gotten older, of course, as we all get older, and it becomes more apparent that our time on Earth is limited. And so what we do is we are much more conscious, I think, of our legacy and what goodness we've contributed to the world. And so for me, a part of that legacy is the research and the publications, because knowing that they will live on way beyond me and will stay probably in somebody's computer base, for many years, and that's that's a nice feeling to have that kind of legacy. So those are generally how things, but in a broader sense, there's kind of been an interesting pattern too. Sort of the arc of my career is I initially would testify a lot in court and did a lot of court work on litigation that involved criminal behavior. So it was post-offense litigation, questions of competency, questions of insanity, just questions of motivation. Why did this person do this particular heinous act? And many of those cases were homicide cases through the years, but it was always post-offense litigation. But the arc of my career has been to move more into prevention rather than explaining after the fact why something has happened. And I found that work when I was very deep into the work of testifying and evaluations and psychological testing, and spending many, many hours with individuals that had done quite horrible things. I found that there was a darkness to it that I needed to, in a sense, titrate or modify a bit. That I needed to pull back from that and begin to do more preventive work that kind of expressed a more optimistic aspect of our existence. So I can tell over the decades that I've moved more in the direction of prevention and away from the post-offense litigation work that I was doing. So now I testify maybe in court, maybe once or twice a year. So the testimony is a lot less than what I used to do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's very interesting that you're bringing that up, because I was thinking that in your work with violence, with aggression, which is something that in general we have thought that it is something very behavioral, very evidence-based, that there's so much research that can be done regarding that, but that you have integrated this with a psychoanalytic thinking, and with, in some ways, that really bring in different dimension to our understanding of these behaviors that are tied up to other issues, to the issues of the personality, to the issues of attachment. And like you said, there's some darkness in these, in these individuals, that you were able to start getting really in depth in understanding that.
Yeah, it's funny. You can be one of the world's experts because there's so few people that have their foot in both worlds. One is in the world of forensics, and the other is in the world of psychoanalysis. And there are just, sadly, there are very few of us that both think analytically and do forensic work. But I have found them to be just a very rich combination that brings a depth of understanding to these cases. And what's so interesting for me too is if in court you explain the psychoanalytic terms in ways that the layperson can understand, people are fascinated by this. Jurors are fascinated by this. Judges pay very, very close attention, as long as you're able to take our understanding and move away from using highly technical terms and instead explain it in ways that can be very clearly understood by the layperson. And I have found that to be a kind of a fascinating part part of the work. But you're absolutely correct, Giselle. In most forensic work is very behavioral, descriptive, and oftentimes forensic experts don't want to move away from just describing behavior, and they're very careful about becoming too inferential in their explanations for why things occur and why people do what they do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So was this in your psychoanalytic training that you learned about the Rorschach?
Oh, good question. Yes, I have, from an actually a very from as a young adult, I was reading psychoanalytic papers and books just for just for leisure, just because I enjoyed it and was really captivated by psychoanalysis. And so that was prior to my being formally educated and getting my PhD and getting my doctorate. It was actually about, let's see, probably about 15 years before my psychoanalytic training, and probably about 10, my formal training at the San Diego Psychoanalytic Institute. And it was probably 10 years prior to me going into my own personal psychoanalysis. In that, I want to be very open about that my personal psychoanalysis was one of the major events in my life. It really was a lifesaver for me, and I would encourage everybody who can do it to go through the process of psychoanalysis themselves, because it's a tremendous growth-inducing and, in a sense, as Freud would put it, a tremendous archaeological expedition to be able to understand yourself as best we can. So that was very important. My Rorschach work began with Sidney Smith, and Sidney Smith was the chief psychologist at the Menninger Foundation. And then Dr. Smith had come to my doctoral program in California in a sense about the last decade of his teaching, and that's who I learned the Rorschach from. And of course, Dr. Sid Smith's tradition was Rappaport, Gill, and Schaefer. Yeah. And so that was my first book where there was an attempt to understand what these ink blots mean and communicate that to the reader. And then also a lesser known figure, Martin Maiman, who Dr. Smith taught in terms of the some of the scoring indices. I think, as I recall, I think it was a form level scoring process that he had developed. So that's how I started with the Rorschach, and then moved into learning the comprehensive system with John Exner and Phil Erdberg, and then also tremendous learning from Irv Weiner, also Paul Lerner, and those individuals were heavily influential. But one of my dearest friends at that time, and also one of my most important teachers, was Phil Erdberg, who at that time was very close to John Exner, and they worked together, and he became a very dear friend, and also a colleague, and a person who was very helpful in guiding me in my Rorschach learning. And then I began to associate with this just great group of men that I met through Society for Personality Assessment. Mm-hmm. Most notably, Carl Giacono and Marv Acklin and Charles Peterson And we had both not only a great time at the SPA meetings, and this was in the early 90s, so this was about 30 years ago. We would have a great social time at the meetings, but then also we began to commiserate because we were all very interested in not only the empirical foundations of the Rorschach, but also in psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic thinking. And so we found we really shared those common intellectual pursuits and then began to work together. Carl and I, of course, began to do the work that we did with the forensic application of the Rorschach, specifically to aggressive and psychopathic personalities. And then in a larger context, we began to think about doing a series of presentations at SPA that we did in the 90s that culminated in the book of Contemporary Rorschach Interpretation, which came out in 1997. So the 90s were a very, very fertile, productive part of my life as far as the Rorschach exploration, doing research, the use of the Rorschach. I would use the Rorschach in all my forensic cases. Mm-hmm. And it was just a very, very rich, productive period for us.
Mm-hmm. Other question. So yeah, you told me that you use your Rorschach in your practice, and what do you think that the Rorschach was adding when you were using it with other structure instruments?
Yeah, I've always been a strong advocate that, of course, you never use the Rorschach alone, that you're using it, you're integrating it with other psychological test instruments. But I thought that it gave a depth of understanding of how the person's mind worked that you would never get from a self-report instrument like the MMPI, the MMPI-2. And this was the time when the first versions of the MMPI were still being utilized. And the self-report instruments, of course, give us lots of good data on an individual, but you didn't have the depth of understanding that you would get with the Rorschach. And I found that to be very meaningful because we needed to not only understand the content of what was in these individuals' minds, but we also needed to know what the structure of their minds were, as to how they would structurally put together, as well as what were the dynamics that were underpinning the more conscious thoughts that they were having. So the Rorschach was tremendously helpful in helping us understand the defensive operations of the mind, the object relations of the person's mind, the attachment proclivities or the absence of any kind of capacity for attachment the person would have. It gave us great insight into their the level of personality, and there I would lean heavily on my on the work of Otto Kernberg and the people that had preceded him in understanding levels of personality, and then the characterological structure of the individual, and that the Rorschach allowed us to gain that kind of understanding of the individual. That there was literally no other psychological tests that would do that.
Right, and not only on the cases of criminality and when there is a lot of complexity, but also in the regular cases of therapy and all that. We have a series of videos where also clinicians talk about how they use Rorschach to really prepare for treatment, to really see the amenability, to really strategize, their treatment. It really has so many different applications.
Absolutely. And that's not an area that I have expertise in, but I certainly appreciate the use of the Rorschach as a way to move forward in terms of planning and preparation for treatment. I wish the Rorschach was more embedded in our profession than it is. I was hopeful that it would that it would become so, but it still is, I think, for people that are devoted to the instrument and understand its use and the power of the Rorschach, they're very committed to making sure that that remains a part of the evaluative process in the work that they do. Also in a larger context, I'm saddened by the fact that many, in fact, most training programs in clinical psychology have moved away from psychoanalytic thinking and the use of the wisdom of psychoanalysis in their training of new clinicians. And I'm saddened by that, but it's just I think it's a reality that we do face.
Right. It's now to each individual psychologist to really see how is it that they are going to enrich their own and really tailor their own training. So fortunately, but it's an opportunity as well.
Yes.
And my last question is about what will be the aspect of your professional life that you're most proud of?
Well, I gave that some thought, Giselle, and I think it's kind of a boring answer, but I think I'm most proud of my body of work, the work that's been published, which in a sense becomes my legacy, and the care with which we've explored in great detail through the years very, very dark aspects of humanity and the human condition, and that I felt like we've really shown and I use the plural we because much of my work has been collaborative with other individuals, and the degree to which we've been able to shine lights into areas of human nature that other people would shy away from or not want to explore or be very intimidated by. And I've always been also proud of not only the collaboration with other professionals, but I'm proud of a lot of the risks that I took to go into these various dangerous settings to evaluate individuals, to evaluate serial murders, to evaluate mass murders, to spend hours and hours with these individuals. Sometimes I think I was probably early on too naive for my own good, that I took chances to stay and sit with these individuals and evaluate them and spend hours trying to understand them. But I'm very happy that I took the risk. One of the most recent things that I'm quite proud of is we just did a paper on, it's called The Last Psychological Evaluation of Charles Manson. And it was just published in the Journal of Threat Assessment and Management. And I'm very proud of that paper. And I think the people watching this will get a kick out of the story, but I was approached about 3 years ago by a psychologist who just sent me an email, who I'd never met, and I didn't know who he was. And he said to me that he had evaluated Charlie Manson in 1997. And so this was now 21 years later, and that he had all this psychological test data on Manson, and he would like to publish it. And so I read the email, and I was both shocked and excited by this email, and immediately wrote him back and said, I'd be happy. Let's talk further about this. And it turned out that he was working as a psychologist for the California Department of Corrections and had evaluated Manson in 1997. Had done a whole variety of psychological testing, including the Rorschach, including the PCLR, an intelligence test, achievement test, MMPI-2. He just had a great amount of data on Manson that the world did not know about any of this data. The world did not know anything about the internal dynamics and structure of probably the most notorious criminal of the 20th century. So what I did was I then assembled his name is Todd Roy, and Todd is the first author on the paper. And so what I did was he asked me if I would assemble a group of people where we would work together to do a deep analysis of all this data. And he had gotten the permission of Manson to publish. And then he'd also gotten the permission of the California Department of Corrections to publish, but only after Manson passed away. And Manson died in 2017. And so that allowed him, 20 years after he'd done this evaluation, allowed him to bring this information forward. So I asked Johnny Mahura if she would be the Rorschach person on the paper. And then I asked if Alan Friedman and Dave Nichols, if they would also join. So then the five of us spent probably about a year and a half working on this project. It was great fun. And then we submitted the paper. Several major psychological assessment journals did not want to publish it. It was rejected.
Wow!
But we did have it accepted, and it's now published. It's actually available on my website too if people want to see it. But it was published in the APA Journal of Threat Assessment and Management. But this was also a very, very interesting aspect to it, was that I do a lot of work in the area of extremism and terrorism. And one of my sort of stunning new revelations for myself was that Charlie Manson is now a hero for many of the neo-Nazi groups. And the reason he's a hero for these groups is because Manson was one of the original, what's called an accelerationist, that he believed that that through his violence, the violence that he would orchestrate, that he would bring about the collapse of society, that the establishment that would collapse, society would collapse through a race war, and that he and his family would come out of the desert after the race war and then be the governing body, would be in charge of the United States and would rule. And this very grandiose, very narcissistic, violent fantasy is what is called helter-skelter. Mm-hmm. And helter-skelter is the term that Manson used for this, what we call an accelerationist fantasy, which is very much alive in the extreme right neo-Nazi groups that we see in the United States, and we also see in Europe, and we also see particularly in Eastern Europe. So it became very relevant to the other work that I do in terms of extremism and terrorism. But here's a very poignant and kind of humorous aspect also to the paper, is that with all terrorists, and Manson was a terrorist, and he had a terrorist cell that he called the Family that carried out these killings in Los Angeles in 1969. But with all terrorists, about 80% of the time, there's a personal grievance. And Manson's personal grievance was he always wanted to be a successful singer and songwriter. And he tried out, he sent copies of his songs and had met Terry Melcher. And Terry Melcher was the producer for the Beach Boys in the 1960s. And he sent his recordings to Terry Melcher for consideration to produce records by Charlie Manson, and Melcher rejected his music. And that became the humiliation and the personal grievance for Charlie Manson. And the house where these killings occurred was a house on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles where Terry Melcher had previously lived. And that's why that house was selected by Manson for that massacre to be carried out. So isn't that, it's such an interesting,
amazing,
compelling, bizarre story. But I think my pride in the paper is to be able to have brought forward for the first time a really in-depth analysis of the mind of Charlie Manson, the psychology of Charlie Manson, and primarily through the lens of the Rorschach, because we published all the Rorschach data. We use the RPAS system in the analysis of the data, but I'm also able to talk about some psychoanalytic constructs in relationship to the data. But all the Rorschach data is in the paper, including the entire Rorschach protocol, as well as all the scoring of the instruments. So it's really it's a point of recent pride for me to have that particular paper be published.
The vision of Roy to really do such a comprehensive evaluation at that time, and to keep it and to get all the releases to do something with it, because I understand he was fairly young and new at the job in the
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so it was just so great that he had the vision and the patience to make sure that everything was acceptable and okay for him to eventually publish, and then to wait 20 years before he would approach me and ask if I would help him do this. So it was really just a nice story.
Yeah, it's a lovely story. And also that he approached you and then you assemble a team that really kind of get into the weeds, and give it the proper place. Because like you said, it's still really applicable. It really has so many lessons that we can use today to understand, this type of terrorism.
Yes.
It's fascinating. Absolutely. It's fascinating. Absolutely. Yeah. That was quite a beautiful gift that you're leaving also in your legacy, I think. So thank you so much.
Yeah, hopefully it won't end too soon. But
no, you have much more probably of things that are going to come.
Yeah, we have to be realistic, though.
I know. Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure to hear about your
thank you, Giselle. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and I hope this will give you some some material that people will find perhaps enjoyable, and I hope helpful in their own thinking and in their own journey.
Thank you so much.